By 1960, Detroit had a problem. Every single manufacturer had spent the last 5 years building bigger, faster, more powerful V8s, and now they had to figure out what came next. The answer, it turned out, was ram induction. Long, twisting intake tubes that snaked across the top of the engine, tuned like a pipe organ to force extra air into the cylinders at exactly the right moment. Suddenly, engines that had already been powerful in 1959 were making even more horsepower in 1960, wearing engineering so exotic it looked like something out of a jet fighter. By the end of this countdown, you'll know exactly which 10 American cars earned the right to be called the fastest of 1960, and why the horsepower war that year got stranger, more inventive, and more aggressive than almost any year before it. This isn't just a list of big engines with bigger names. This is the story of the year Detroit stopped simply adding cylinders and carburetors and started tuning the physics of air itself. Cross-ram manifolds, long ram intakes, engines built specifically to win at Daytona, and then sold to the public with barely any changes at all. Nobody called it a horsepower war yet, in plain language, but 1960 is exactly when it started to look like one. For 1960, nearly every major American manufacturer switched to unibody construction for the first time, shedding the heavier body-on-frame designs of the 1950s. Lighter cars meant better performance from the same engines, and Detroit's engineers used that extra margin to chase horsepower harder than ever. Chrysler Corporation introduced its radical cross-ram induction system, an intake manifold so long it had to snake across the engine bay to reach the opposite cylinder head. Dodge, Plymouth, and DeSoto all adopted versions of the same technology under different marketing names. General Motors, meanwhile, kept pushing its existing big blocks to new highs. Pontiac quietly built a small batch of race-only Super Duty 389s for NASCAR homologation, years before anyone had heard the name GTO. And underneath it all, one flagship brand, DeSoto, was running out of time entirely, building some of its best engines in its very last full model year. Let's start the countdown. Number 10 is a story about a giant that got tamed. Back in 1958, Mercury had quietly built the single most powerful production engine in America, the Super Marauder 430, a triple carburetor monster rated at 400 horsepower, built by hot rod legend Bill Strop and sold almost without any marketing at all. By 1960, that same 430 cubic inch V8 was still available in the Mercury Park Lane, but Mercury had detuned it down to a single two-barrel carburetor, rated at just 310 horsepower. It's still a genuinely large, capable V8, enough to move a full-size park lane with real authority, and standard equipment on Mercury's flagship model. But it's also a reminder that horsepower numbers in Detroit didn't always climb in a straight line. Sometimes the division's mightiest engine quietly got walked back a few years later for reasons of cost, insurance, or corporate caution. And 1960's Park Lane 430 is a perfect example of a giant that had already seen its best days. Number 9 returns to Cadillac's flagship convertible, 1 year removed from the tallest tail fins in automotive history. For 1960, Cadillac toned the fins down slightly from 1959's extreme peak, but kept the performance intact. The Eldorado again came standard with Cadillac's 390 cubic inch V8, fitted with triple two-barrel Rochester carburetors, producing approximately 345 horsepower, genuinely serious output for a luxury convertible of that era. Cadillac built the Eldorado in relatively small numbers, even in a good year, and 1960 was no exception, making a well-optioned tri-power Eldorado one of the rarer full-size Cadillacs of the entire early 1960s. It's proof that even as the tailfin era began to wind down, Cadillac wasn't ready to give up on genuine horsepower just yet. Number 8 introduces one of the most striking body styles Ford ever built, the fastback Starliner, paired with the most powerful engine Ford Motor Company had built up to that point. Introduced as a sleeker, fastback-roofed version of the full-size Galaxy, the Starliner debuted for 1960 with a standard 292 cubic inch V8. But mid-year, Ford quietly rolled out the 352 High Performance package, nicknamed the 352 Hi-Po, rated at 360 horsepower, making it, at the time of its release, the single most powerful factory engine Ford had ever built. It was also one of the first American V8s to exceed 1 horsepower per cubic inch of displacement. Because the Hi-Po engine was never heavily advertised, it remains something of a hidden gem today, with no reliable production figures ever published. A Starliner fitted with a well-built 352 was clocked at 157.9 miles an hour on the Bonneville Salt Flats in 1960, genuine proof that Ford's quiet fastback had real teeth behind its sleek new roofline. Number 7 brings back Chevrolet's 348 Big Block, still working just as hard in its third year on the market. The 1960 Impala carried the 348 cubic inch turbo-thrust V8 forward largely unchanged from 1959, still available across a wide spread of tunes, from a 250 horsepower base 4-barrel all the way up to a 335 horsepower special turbo-thrust version with triple 2-barrel carburetors and high compression. Chevrolet also offered a 320 horsepower single 4-barrel high compression option in between, giving buyers a genuinely wide menu of performance for a full-size family car. Chevrolet's fuel-injected small block option, meanwhile, quietly disappeared from the Impala lineup for 1960, a sign that even as Chevrolet, Ram induction and triple carburetors were proving to be the more practical path to big horsepower than complex mechanical fuel injection. The 348 would only remain in production for one more year, but in 1960, it was still one of the most flexible big block engines in America. Number 6 belongs to the Wildcat 401. 1 year into its life, now doing duty across Buick's midline performance flagship, the Invicta. The 1960 Invicta carried the same 401 cubic inch nailhead V8 introduced the year before in the Electra, factory rated at 325 horsepower at 4,400 RPM, paired with Buick's twin-turbine Dynaflow automatic transmission. It remained one of the most torque-rich engines in America, built around the same distinctive upright nail-head valve arrangement that gave Buick's big blocks their name. The Invicta positioned itself as Buick's sportier alternative to the more luxury-focused Electra, wrapped in slightly lighter trim and marketed toward buyers who wanted genuine performance without stepping all the way up to Buick's true flagship. It's a car most people walk past at a show today, but under the hood sits the same engine family that would carry Buick's performance reputation well into the muscle car era. Number 5 keeps Oldsmobile's biggest rocket V8 rolling into a new decade. The 1960 Super 88 and 98 both carried forward the 394 cubic inch rocket V8 introduced the year before, factory rated at 315 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque with a single 4-barrel Rochester carburetor. It remained the largest engine Oldsmobile had ever built and one of the most torque-heavy engines in the entire GM lineup that year. Oldsmobile restyled its full-size cars for 1960, with flatter, less aggressive tail fins than the year before, a sign that the industry's tail fin obsession was already beginning to cool even as the horsepower race kept climbing. The 394 Rocket would carry on almost unchanged for several more years, eventually forming the basis for Oldsmobile's high-compression Starfire and Skyrocket performance engines of the early 1960s. Number 4 brings the very first Plymouth Sonoramic Commando, the first time Chrysler's radical new cross-ram induction system reached the Plymouth lineup. For 1960, Plymouth introduced its all-new 383 cubic inch V8 as the top engine option for the Fury, fitted with Chrysler's new cross-ram intake manifold and dual 4-barrel Carter carburetors, factory rated at 330 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque. Buyers who wanted a slightly less exotic option could still choose the carryover Golden Commando 395, a 361 cubic inch V8 rated at 305 horsepower. 0 to 60 came in around 7.5 seconds for a well-driven Sonoramic Fury, with a top speed reported well over 120 miles an hour, genuinely serious numbers for a full-size American sedan in 1960. Plymouth styling that year, though, fell out of favor with buyers who had grown tired of tail fins, and sales stayed roughly flat even as the engineering underneath kept getting more advanced. Number 3 introduces Dodge's brand new flagship and the very same cross-ram technology wearing a different badge. The 1960 Polara replaced Dodge's old coronet-based hierarchy as the division's new top-of-the-line model, positioned to compete directly with the Pontiac Bonneville. Standard power came from a 383 cubic inch V8 rated at 325 horsepower with a single 4-barrel carburetor. But buyers who checked the D500 option box got the same cross-ram induction system found in the Chrysler 300F and Plymouth Fury, with dual 4-barrel carburetors feeding through those distinctive 30-inch tuned intake runners, rated at 330 horsepower and 460 pound-feet of torque. The Polara was, by most accounts, too heavy and too tall-geared for explosive standing start acceleration, but it thrived at highway speed, with a top end reported in the 130-mile-an-hour range, well beyond what its tires and suspension of the era could really handle. Dodge sold fewer than 17,000 Polaras for the entire model year, making a genuine cross-ram D500 one of the rarer performance cars in America that season. Not every performance story from 1960 has a happy ending. This one belongs to DeSoto, and it's the story of a brand building some of its best engines in the very same year it was already being quietly written off. For 1960, DeSoto simplified its lineup down to just 2 series, the Fireflight and the Adventurer, both sharing Chrysler's new 383 cubic inch V8. The base version made 305 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor. A Power Pack 4-barrel option raised that to 325, and the top Ram-charged cross-ram version, sharing the same cross-ram technology found in Dodge Polara and Plymouth Fury, pushed output even higher, rivaling Dodge's own flagship engine. It didn't matter. DeSoto's sales had been in a freefall for 2 straight years, and on November 30th, 1960, just 47 days after the 1961 models were introduced, Chrysler Corporation officially announced the end of the DeSoto brand. The final DeSotos built were, in many ways, some of the best engineered cars the division had ever produced. They simply arrived about 3 years too late. Number 2 takes us back to Pontiac's 389, now wearing a brand new trim level and hiding one of the best-kept secrets of the entire model year. The 1960 Ventura debuted as a new premium trim level slotted between the Star Chief and the Bonneville, offered as a 2-door Sport Coupe or 4-door Vista hardtop. The standard 389 cubic inch V8 made up to 283 horsepower in 4-barrel form, with an optional tri-power version, 3 2-barrel Rochester carburetors, pushing output to 318 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque. But here's the detail that matters most. Pontiac also quietly built a small run of Super Duty 389 engines for 1960. Rated at 368 horsepower, sold over-the-counter to buyers who knew to ask for them specifically. The Super Duty 389 engine dominated NASCAR that season, winning 7 of 44 Grand National races in 1960 alone. This exact engine family, developed here, raced here, and quietly sold here, would be revived 4 years later almost unchanged to power a new mid-size Pontiac coupe called the GTO, the car most often credited with starting the muscle car era as America came to know it. And that brings us to number 1, the fastest, most technologically radical American production car of 1960, the Chrysler 300F. Built on Chrysler's new lightweight unibody platform, the 300F introduced the wildest induction system Detroit had ever put into full production, the Cross-Ram, a pair of 30-inch tuned intake runners that crossed over the top of the engine, each one feeding the cylinder bank on the opposite side. Standard power came from the 413 cubic inch RBV8, factory rated at 375 horsepower and 495 pound-feet of torque. For buyers who wanted even more, Chrysler offered a rare solid-lifter short ram version rated at 400 horsepower with 465 pound-feet of torque. A 300F set a new flying mile record in Daytona Beach in 1960, running 144.92 miles an hour. And in one of the great forgotten stories of the entire horsepower war, Chrysler quietly pulled 6 300Fs off the regular assembly line and handed them to a team of engineers for what became known as the Gran Turismo program. Cars fitted with French-built 4-speed manual gearboxes, experimental cylinder heads, and specially shaved racing tires, sent to compete in the flying mile at Daytona Beach, where they claimed the top 6 finishing positions outright. Just 964 hardtops and 248 convertibles were built for the entire model year at a price over $5,400, a genuinely enormous sum in 1960. Fast, radical, and quietly dominant at Daytona, the 1960 Chrysler 300F earned the top spot on this list. So what did all of this actually prove? That by 1960, Detroit had moved past simply adding cylinders and horsepower numbers and started engineering the physics of air itself. Cross-ram manifolds, long-tuned intake runners, and race-only engines sold quietly over dealership counters to anyone who knew to ask. That Pontiac Super Duty 389, built and raced in 1960, was already carrying the exact DNA that would become the GTO just 4 years later. And that not every brand chasing the horsepower war survived it. DeSoto built some of its finest engines in 1960. In the very same year, its own parent company decided to shut the lights off for good. The words horsepower war hadn't fully entered the American vocabulary yet in 1960, but by the time this year was over, it was already being fought on every front: in intake manifold design, in NASCAR homologation rules, and in showrooms across the entire country. The muscle car era did not appear out of nowhere in 1964. It was built slowly, one tuned intake runner at a time, and 1960 quietly proved that Detroit's engineers were already thinking further ahead than almost anyone driving these cars realized at the time. Which 1960 American car would you bring back if you could only choose one? The cross-ram Chrysler 300F, the GTO ancestor Pontiac Ventura, or one of the forgotten machines further down this list? Did your father, your uncle, or a neighbor on your street own one of these cars? Write the name in the comments below.